What is up, guys? So for this video I want to discuss and analyze the 4th episode of season 4 of Better Call Saul entitled Talk. This is a very thought-provoking and methodical episode that also provided us with some rather unexpected moments as well. So without further delay, let's jump right into this review for episode 4. Okay, so right off the bat, the cold opening scene of this episode presented us with an extremely unexpected and compelling flashback of Mike Ehrmantraut as a young man working on a carport with his son Matty. This flashback then abruptly cut to the present day of a scene of Mike at a support group meeting where he stated, "You wanted me to talk, I talked." Interestingly, in regards to the flashback component of this opening scene, this flashback was actually a direct reference to a piece of dialogue that occurred in season 3 of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Off Brand, which occurred following the first support group meeting Mike attended with his daughter-in-law, Stacy.
Sure it is, Pop. You built a carport when Matty was a kid.
I did.
Yeah, he told me about it a bunch of times. He said that when you were pricing it out, you thought that all the people who gave you quotes were crooks. So you decided to do it yourself. And you let Matty write his initials in the wet cement.
So, with this context in mind, while this opening scene was initially rather opaque in its intentions, Mike's plot that would transpire over the course of this episode would truly convey why the creators of Better Call Saul decided to open this episode in this rather enigmatic fashion. Following this cold opening scene, the first act of this episode then opened with a scene of one of Gus Fring's henchmen who we first saw in the plot of season 3 of Better Call Saul in the episode entitled Witness. During this scene, we saw this henchman deliver some drugs to an unknown gang of people at a rundown motel, which was then followed by this henchman returning to a car being driven by Victor. This scene would of course end up foreshadowing the dramatic scene that would occur at the end of Act 2. Following the scene, the second scene in Act 1 presented us with a rather cryptic scene where we saw Jimmy reject another job offer that was given to him by the local cell phone store we saw him circle in the classified section of the newspaper during the season 4 premiere. Following this rejection by Jimmy, we then saw Kim speak with Jimmy regarding her recommendation that he see a therapist. While this request clearly seemed to rather confuse Jimmy as to why Kim made this recommendation at all, from Kim's point of view, I think this action certainly stemmed from her belief that Jimmy was not properly grieving about the fact that his last blood relative had just killed himself. That being said, in an interesting turn of events, following this recommendation from Kim, Jimmy then stated to Kim that he had gotten a job that unbeknownst to Kim, he had just turned down. Following Kim then meeting this news with praise and support and then leaving the apartment to go to work, we then saw Jimmy call up the company that had offered him this job and told them that he had reconsidered. So, taking all of these details about this scene into consideration, while we cannot know for certain why Jimmy initially turned down this job offer, it seems that this recommendation by Kim to see a therapist, an action that Jimmy really seems to have no desire whatsoever to do, made him reconsider this position and accept this job offer, possibly as a means to navigate around this desired recommendation by Kim for him to see a therapist, via the excuse of him being too busy working to do so. That being said, in the grand scheme of things, I think this scene in Act 1 exemplifies the fact that Jimmy and Kim have not been effectively communicating with one another and articulating their true beliefs and desires following the aftermath of Chuck's death, seemingly out of fear of hurting one another, which based on everything we know about this plot does not seem to bode well for both of these characters in the coming episodes. Following the scene, the third scene in Act 1 then displayed a scene of Kim observing court cases at the Bernalillo County Courthouse. This action by Kim would then lead the judge presiding over these cases to call Kim into his chambers during a recess and question Kim regarding her presence in his courtroom. That being said, this judge then claimed to see right through Kim's intentions of attending these court cases as a means to reinvigorate her passion for the law. This judge then proceeded to state to Kim that he's seen many other lawyers who were in the same position as her try to do this as well, and then told Kim that she was extremely lucky to have the job she had at Mesa Verde, and that she will not find whatever she is looking for by sitting around his courtroom all day. However, while it looked like Kim might in fact take this seemingly sound advice that she is romanticizing the law, this conversation was then followed by Kim completely rejecting this advice, much to the surprise of this judge, who then following this conversation saw Kim sitting in his courtroom in the exact same manner as before. So with all of this information about the scene being taken into consideration, the question remains of why did Kim return to the courtroom after talking with this judge? That being said, while we cannot know for certain what Kim was thinking in this scene, Kim is obviously an extremely intelligent character who knew exactly what the judge was recommending to her, but acted in spite of it. Furthermore, I think that everything that is currently going on in Kim's life most certainly contributed to her rejecting this recommendation and continuing to do what she originally intended prior to speaking with this judge of seemingly trying to find some passion or meaning in the law following questioning her line of work in the previous episode. Following the conclusion of Act 1, Act 2 of this episode then opened with a scene of Mike and Anita at Loyola's diner that ended up further foreshadowing the scene in this episode that related to the cold opening scene during a conversation that Mike and Anita had involving Mike accusing one of the members of their therapy group of fabricating his story about his dead wife. As a side note, in addition to the foreshadowing that was present in this scene, what also made this scene rather compelling was the fact that Anita was wearing a name tag for the Craddock Marine Bank during this scene, which interestingly was the same bank that Mike used in Season 5 of Breaking Bad in the episode entitled Say My Name, in the plot involving giving Gus Fring's men their hazard pay. That being said, I think this subtle detail that was added in this scene was possibly done so in order to foreshadow the backstory of how Mike would eventually end up using this bank in the aforementioned plot of Breaking Bad. Following the scene, the second scene in Act 2 then opened with a scene of Jimmy during his first day of work at CC Mobile, which we saw was beyond unstimulating for him due to the fact that Jimmy is definitely not the type of person who can just sit around all day with nothing to do, which he quickly discovers appears to be one of the main components of this job. That being said, however, this scene of Jimmy would end up foreshadowing a plot that would occur over the course of this episode. Following this scene, the third scene in Act 2 then displayed a scene of the cousins and Nacho staking out the same motel that was displayed in the opening scene of Act 1. Following Nacho providing the cousins with some false information that the gang at this motel was the gang who hit the Salamancas in a surprising twist, following Nacho thinking that they would carefully plan out this hit against this gang, claiming that they would need many more heavily armed men to pull off this hit, including Domingo, i.e. Crazy 8, who is finally mentioned for the first time this season. Upon hearing this information from Nacho, the cousins then proceeded to get out of the car and virtually single-handedly take out this entire gang with some assistance from the still injured Nacho. That being said, while this scene culminated with the cousins and Nacho taking out this gang relatively unscathed, from a production point of view, I thought it was very interesting that the shootout scene was displayed from Nacho's point of view, who stayed in the car during a large portion of the scene, which as a result made the scene more about Nacho's reaction to seeing all of this carnage and contemplating his own situation with the cartel, as opposed to seeing all of the violent and intricate details of this shootout itself, which as a result also further added to the mystique of the cousins for being able to virtually pull off this feat single-handedly. Following the conclusion of Act 2, this shootout would then directly relate to the scene of Nacho and Gus that would occur in the first scene of Act 3, where Nacho reported to Gus that this whole entire gang had been taken out by the cousins, who following this hit will stay down in Mexico until the heat dies down. Furthermore, Nacho's dialogue in this scene also seemed to indicate that this shootout in this episode was all according to Gus Fring's plan, which appeared to be set in motion by the false information that Nacho told the cousins in the previous episode, which appeared to be exactly what Gus Fring wanted Nacho to tell the cousins due to the context of this scene of Nacho stating to Gus that he discovered his intentions that this hit was to gain control of this gang's territory, which could not be given to the Salamancas during this period of chaos they are going through, which as a result would be given to Gus, which would also give him more power and leverage with the cartel. Following Nacho stating this scene would then of course culminate with Gus stating to Nacho to get some rest because he still has more to do for him, which based on what Nacho has already done for Gus so far was an incredibly eerie statement which implied that Nacho should get some rest so that he can be at full strength in order to continue to be used as a pawn in Gus Fring's plan against the cartel. Following this scene, the second scene in Act 3 then displayed a scene that had been foreshadowed over the course of this episode of Mike at the support group with his daughter-in-law Stacy, which culminated with Mike telling off the man who he had previously accused to Anita had been fabricating a story about his dead wife. This then led Mike to chastise the entire support group for enabling this man and for enabling one another to sulk in their own misery. That being said, this overt anger that Mike displayed in this scene seemed to stem from the story that his daughter-in-law Stacy told at this meeting prior to his outburst, where she stated that she had not thought about Mike's son Maddie at all that morning, which surprised her and also made her worry that there could be a point in her life where she no longer thinks about him at all, which we could see clearly upsets Mike. So with that being said, while there are in fact many different possible interpretations for what caused Mike to finally react in this manner and finally call out this man after listening to his fabricated story for months, I think the fact that Mike realized that his own son's memory was being forgotten by Stacy reinforced his own guilt and responsibility over his son's death, which caused Mike to become very upset. Furthermore, I think the opening scene of this episode of Mike building this carport with his son was in fact going through Mike's head during his daughter-in-law's story due to the fact that during the aforementioned episode of Season 3 of Better Call Saul where the scene was mentioned, Mike himself stated that he did not remember the story of building this carport when it was mentioned to him by Stacy. And now, following the story by Stacy, I think Mike realized that he too had forgotten some memories about his son as well, which then also further contributed to Mike becoming upset in this scene. So, taking all of the details about this scene into consideration, while I do not think we will see Mike at the support group meeting any longer following this outburst, I think the ultimate purpose of Mike's plot in this episode, including this flashback scene, was to display the life that Mike once had that would now be juxtaposed in this episode with the beginning of his new life working for Gus Fring. Following the conclusion of Act 3, the first scene in Act 4 then opened with a scene of Nacho's father returning home, where he discovered that the still injured Nacho broke into his home to rest as per Gus Fring's recommendation, following all that he had been through over the course of this season. That being said, I think the scene of Nacho and his father in this episode was in fact a representation of Nacho's truly untenable situation with Gus and the cartel, which has caused him and his father a great deal of pain and suffering. And taking that into consideration, I think Nacho knows that if he does not do something soon to ameliorate this situation with Gus and the cartel, he will likely be killed, which could also lead to the death of his father. So that being said, while this is of course only speculation, I wonder if this scene is in fact foreshadowing Nacho thinking about how to mitigate this situation with the cartel in order to save himself as well as his father. Following this scene, the second scene in Act 4 then opened with the scene of Mike continuing his security checks at Madrigal, much to the dismay of Lydia, but essentially given the approval of by Gus. This scene would then of course culminate with Mike receiving a phone call from Victor, who stated to him that Gus wants to meet with him, which as a result would finally lead to the first meeting between Mike and Gus in the plot of Better Call Saul this season. Following this scene, the third scene in Act 4 then picked up with Jimmy at work at CC Mobile, with his day being just as uneventful as it had been in the previous scene. However, during the scene, we saw Jimmy temporarily close the store so that he could meet up with Ira, who we can see appears to be working for a vending company at this point in time, in order to get his share of the Hummel figurine that Ira sold at the Hummel Expo, which ended up going for well over what Jimmy thought it would. Following Ira then stating to Jimmy if he ever needs to do another job to call the vet to get in touch with him, due to the fact that he gets a new phone every time he does a job, due to the fear that the police could be listening on his conversation. This scene would then culminate with Jimmy returning to work, where following some inspiration from Ira, we saw him paint an advertisement on the front of the cell phone store, which offered the store services in a not so subtle way to people who would want to use cell phones for implied felonious purposes, which I'm not so sure the owners of the store will enjoy. So with all this being said, I think the main point of this scene in this episode was to display that Ira currently does not yet own and operate Vamanos Pest at this point in time, and also to introduce Jimmy to the world of burner phones that he would readily use over the course of Breaking Bad. And based on all of the information that has been presented to us about the plot of Jimmy this season, it looks like Jimmy will take a very active approach to selling these cell phones to people who will use them for criminal purposes in the coming episode. Following the scene, the final scene of this episode in Act 4 finally culminated with Mike meeting with Gus for the first time this season at the Los Pollos Hermanos distribution center. During this meeting, we saw a less than deferential Mike answer to a visibly upset Gus for not telling him about Nacho's plan against Hector, which Mike responds by stating that while he agreed he would not kill Hector, he did not promise to be his bodyguard. Following Mike then tough-talking Gus, knowing that Gus does not actually plan to kill him for this transgression, Mike then stated to Gus that he knows that he brought him to the Los Pollos Hermanos distribution center to do a job, and then stated to him, "Why don't you stop running a game on me and just tell me about the job?" That being said, in regards to Mike's actions in this final scene, I thought it was very odd to see Mike act this way to Gus, following his reverent approach to interacting with Gus in the plot of Breaking Bad. However, I think what Mike went through in this episode regarding his son at the therapy group likely contributed to Mike acting in the manner that he did towards Gus in this scene. That being said, in regards to Gus tolerating this level of disrespect from Mike, I think that due to the fact that Mike has already done a tremendous amount for Gus, in addition to the fact that Gus still needs Mike and recognizes Mike has a very desirable skill set that will continue to be of great use to him, caused Gus to give Mike some leeway in this scene. That being said, while the scene cut to black following this aforementioned quote by Mike, based on the teasers that we have seen for the 5th episode of Season 4, I think this job Gus has for Mike could involve Gus using Mike's security expertise to survey the industrial laundry in the next episode as part of the beginning stages of buying the location for the super lab we first saw in the plot of Season 3 of Breaking Bad. So with all of these details from this episode of Better Call Saul being taken into consideration, I thought that while this was without a doubt the slowest paced episode of the season so far, it nonetheless also provided us with some very captivating and puzzling scenes that presented us with a very large amount of plot and character development that left us to ponder the true mindsets of all the characters who were involved in this episode, which would of course at the same time be juxtaposed with one of the biggest shootout scenes that has occurred in either Better Call Saul or Breaking Bad. Furthermore, I think the deliberately methodical pace that has been displayed during the season so far is in fact a good reminder of all of the backstory that still needs to be told about all of these characters in the plot of Season 4 and beyond before we can even think about the timeline of Better Call Saul meeting up with the timeline of Breaking Bad. And that being said, I cannot wait to see more of this incredibly captivating and thought-provoking backstory displayed to us next week. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any new videos about the plot of Season 4 of Better Call Saul. As always, my name is Anton Jackson. Thanks again for watching.